Hi, I'm Leanpub from Leanpub, and in this episode of the Front Matter podcast, I'll be interviewing Neil Keleher. Based in Taichung City, Taiwan, Neil is a full-stack developer with a degree in systems design engineering from the University of Waterloo, and he's also a longtime yoga teacher. You can follow him on Twitter at Neil Keleher, and that's Neil as in kneeling, and check out his website at sensational-yoga-poses.com. Neil is the author of a number of Leanpub books, including his latest two, Learning How to Learn, Mental Models, and Know to Flow. In the books, Neil writes about how when we learn, our brain builds models, and those models form the foundation of our understanding, and about how to get in the flow to improve performance across a wide variety of activities. In this interview, we're going to talk about Neil's background and career, his interests, his books, and at the end, we'll talk a little bit about his experience as a self-published author. So thank you very much, Neil, for being on the Front Matter podcast, finally.
Thank you, Len, and thanks for calling me a full stack developer. I'd say I'm a beginning full stack developer. I've just learned Node.js and I've done some apps. Anyway, I'll
No,
leave
that's
that.
great. No, it's funny. I always say to people just before we start recording, I'm going to do my introduction and you can correct all my mistakes. And so you just did that. That's actually a really good way to start. So I always like to start these interviews by asking people about their origin story. So I know you have a very interesting background and you've done a lot of different things. So I was wondering if you could just talk a little bit about where you grew up, and maybe we'll go through your journey to Taiwan.
Okay. Well, first of all, I think part of my journey actually started so I was born in England. We moved to Canada when I was 6, and then I moved back to England when I was 16, 17 to join the British Army. But before that, I think some of my most important life lessons was in grade 7 or grade 6 science class. We had a teacher, Mr. Tollett, and I remember one of the first lessons, he was explaining what science was. And nowadays there's a lot of discussion about science and what it is and what it isn't. But I remember him very simply saying science is the process of building models. And he talked about models. He said a model can never truly represent, the thing it represents. So science, bear in mind, this is about 40 years ago so I'm trying to remember exactly what he said, but this is what I remember. Science is the process of improving models, or part of science is in process of improving models so that they better predict or better represent what they're supposed to represent. So that sort of stuck with me. And that's, I think, a big essential element of the mental modeling book. And another thing I might have learned in grade 7, or it might have been afterwards when I went back to university and was studying engineering, was this idea of references. So when you talk about measuring temperature, we need a 0 degrees Celsius. For Fahrenheit, it's whatever it is for the Fahrenheit scale. But in anything where there's some sort of measurement, we need a datum. And they brought up a whole bunch of different things. So, for example, if you're measuring voltage, you need a reference point to be able to specify voltage effectively. Or for current, you need to specify a direction in which current flows. So that was another thing I learned in science class. And then another idea, and I have another website called Zero Parallax, which is sort of like I don't do a lot of work on there, but that sort of tries to capture the essence of what I try to write about and do. But I had a teacher, Miss Klobuchar, in grade 8 chemistry, and she talked about, in chemistry class, one of the first things she talked about was measuring fluids. And we held a beaker. Obviously, this isn't a beaker, but you had to hold your eyes level with, say, the level of the fluid so that you could get an accurate reading, so you eliminate parallax. So here I've got parallax because I'm looking down, so the reading's going to be inaccurate. Likewise here. And so the idea of the website one of my websites I created called Zero Parallax was the idea of understanding how you relate to something so that you can find the position where there's zero parallax. But another point of view was understanding. So a more common way to talk about parallax is if you're looking at a clock, and if you're looking at it straight on, the clock with hands, not the digital type, you can see exactly what time it is. But if you're at the side of it, say the hand is close to 12 o'clock, you might think it's it looks like it's more like 2 minutes past the hour or 2 minutes ahead of the hour. So there's two things. One is if you understand how you relate to the clock, if you see you're off, you can sort of correct for that viewing error. You can zero parallax and say, oh, it's actually whatever time it is. But on the other hand, if you understand how you relate and you understand that your relationship is slightly off and you can't correct for it, you can sort of make well, I understand that my viewing error is off, so I can account for that error and say that I think it's whatever time it is. So if you understand your relationship, you can correct for parallax for the viewing error. So those were sort of three basic, very important things which I've sort of carried throughout my life. And a thing with parallax is about understanding how two things relate, how you relate to the thing you're looking at. And it was interesting because I was talking with a girl who I knew a long time ago. When I first moved to Taiwan, I was teaching English. She was another English teacher. And we talked about parallax, and she talked about driving a boat and how when you're driving a boat, particularly a speedboat, but I guess with a sailing boat as well, you could be going straight ahead, but the boat could be skewed like that and, driving ahead like that. So the idea of sort of parallel, it's sort of a relationship is orienting the boat so that it is in line with the direction it's traveling. That's something you don't encounter with driving a car. And then she talked about piloting a plane because she also did piloting. When you're in a small plane, you're either to the left or the right of the center line, much like driving a car. But when you're, say, landing a plane and to center yourself on the runway, you have to understand where you are with respect to the plane so that you can center yourself with respect to the runway. So I'd say those are sort of three very important points of my background, which have sort of carried through to even today. And so to skip ahead, do you need to ask anything there?
That's really good. I really like this. It's interesting. We've done a launch interview before, so Neil and I have talked a little bit before, so I'm familiar with some of these ideas already. But it is so I'm just going to observe that there is this interesting kind of through line from the beginning to now, and the many things you've done in your life and things you've written about. So for example, even when you talk about relative positioning, that's a part of the way you when you're writing about yoga, for example, or sort of like knowing the relative position of limbs in your body when you're in various poses and things like that. And I just find that sort of interesting. But one thing I did want to ask you about is joining the British Army.
Yeah.
Why did you do that, and what was that like?
Well, it's that interesting because I was before this interview, I was watching a previous interview we did. Was it Simon Brown? I said the name.
Yeah.
Do you remember the name? And he, you were talking about university and him going to university, picking out university, and it reminded me exactly of why I wanted to join the army, because I grew up in Toronto, East York, and I remember trudging to school one day, and it was sort of February, March, when the snow gets all really heavy and it's just horrible. And I might have been in grade 11. And I thought, I just don't want to spend, because at the time, the university, college admin people would come to school asking us what we wanted to do in school. And my thought was, I don't even know what I want to do. How can I make a decision? Because the idea of university is generally to prepare you for life after university, but I don't even have a clue what I want to do after university, and you're expecting me to make these decisions. And then suppose I make a decision that entails another 4 years of more school, straight from regular school. And I was trudging through the school. I don't want to spend another 5 years in school studying. I just want to get out of here. And so, because all of these people were coming to school to ask us what we wanted to do, and I didn't know. And I got attracted to the idea of joining the army, and maybe because my dad was in the army. At one point, maybe I thought I wanted to join the Navy, and it just became that's what I want to do. I was talking to my dad about it, and he said, "Well, if you want to join the army, and if you know that's what you want to do, why not move to England now because for whatever reason, even though I grew up in Canada, and as I said, I was born in England, I had this idea that I wanted to join the British Army because maybe it was the better army, and also because because I'd been in Air Cadets and they knew I had flat feet. I couldn't get into the Canadian Army because it was in my records that I had flat feet, which, when you're trying to get in the Army is you generally, they don't admit you. And so just quickly, what I had to do to pass the British medical is hide the fact that I had flat feet. So basically if this is my foot's like this, what I basically learned how to do is to form an arch with my foot. At the time, I didn't know how I did it, but that's how I passed the British Army medical. And that in turn sort of led me into it was part of what led me into becoming a yoga teacher, that sort of body awareness. But my dad suggested to me, well, if you think you want to join the army, why not move to England now? Figure out if it is actually what you want to do. Then the thing is, you can always continue. If you decide you don't like it, you can leave, go back to school. But failing that, you can always continue your education in the army, because when he was in the army, he bettered himself by doing correspondence courses. And the thing was, said, you're doing correspondence courses, so you're learning, but at the same time, you're getting paid. So you're being paid to learn. And at the same time, you're getting to figure out whether or not you want to be in the army. And the one thing he did say is, rather than joining the infantry, why not get a trade so that, again, if you decide to leave the army or when you decide to leave the army, you've got something to fall back on, something you can do after the army. And so that was so I picked the Royal Electrical Mechanical Engineers, or REME, which is basically, those are the people that, the mechanics, the what have you. And so the trade I picked was armorer, someone who fixes guns, which probably isn't the most practical thing to come out of the army with, but nevertheless, that is what I picked. So that's more or less the reason I joined the army. And the funny thing was, when I moved to England, I thought it was what I wanted to do as a career. So walked into the careers office, said, I want to sign up for 22 years. And they said, oh, wait a minute. The maximum you can sign on for is 9 years. And actually we have 3, 6, or 9 years. So I said, okay, yeah, sure. I'll sign up for 9 years. Me at 16 years old, committing to the rest of my life. And the reason to pick 9 years versus 6 or 3 is the actual pay is a little bit more. But if anyone has a similar idea, I would strongly suggest doing 3 years, because after 3 years, they try to convince you to sign on again, and they'll give you courses and whatnot. But if you sign up for 9 years, they know you've got you. And so, if anyone is deciding following my footsteps, I would strongly suggest doing 3 years instead. But anyway.
And did you have to do basic training or something?
Yeah, basic training. And because it was REME, we're supposed to be more intelligent, the basic training was fairly curtailed compared to, say, someone whose job it is to fire guns. So after basic training, it was 6 months trade training. And I should point out here, I actually bought myself out of the army after 5 years. I had to do a minimum of 3 years after trade training, so they get their money back, and then I could buy myself out. And one of the reasons I decided that being in the army wasn't for me was working with guns was so boring. Like, they're such simple machines. Like, once you've learned them, fixing, repairing weapons is really boring. But what was interesting was just when I came up time for me to PVR, premature voluntary request, the first Gulf War started, where Saddam invaded Kuwait. I get stuck on rear party, which is basically the people who guard the camp while everyone else gets carted off to Kuwait. And then the CSM, the company sergeant major, who's in charge of my division, basically my boss, he said, that's a really crappy job. There's this posting that's come up to Bavaria ski chalet. You can help run the REME ski chalet for however long it is. I thought, oh, great. And so while the Gulf War was on, I got sent to a ski chalet in Bavaria. I was helping run this ski chalet because they send soldiers there for sort of adventure training. So I ended up for 6 months at this ski chalet, skiing in the winter and then cycling in the summer. And and that was interesting because one of the things I did while I was in the Army was I studied correspondence courses. And one of the things I loved doing while I was at this ski chalet was cross country skiing and using wax skis where you stick the wax on the bottom for grip. And we were skiing one time and going up a hill, and the boss said, if you want to go uphill, the best way is to lean forward onto your poles. And I remember doing part of my math course this was English A-level math, where there's a pure and an applied section, and the applied section, which is basically what we call physics in engineering school. There's a part about force vectors, force vectors. So if you have a force going at an angle, you can divide that into vectors. So there's a component going that way and a component going down. So basically what I figured out was if I wanted the most force pressing down on the wax pocket while I'm going uphill so I have better grip, the better answer is to position my center of gravity directly over the wax pocket so that I'm basically pressing down on the wax pocket with as much force as possible. So what I did was basically centered myself over the wax pocket, and I found, given the wax, I could actually go up a ski hill pretty easily. So I'm sort of jumping ahead, but that was sort of one of the experiences that I got in the Army. But going back, so I'm at this ski chalet. Meanwhile, one of my sister's friends, who I was also friends with, turned up at my parents' house when she found out about the war, and she was a little bit in tears because she thought I was going down to Bavaria. She thought I was going to the Gulf War to fight. And my dad says, "Well, actually, he's in Bavaria at a ski chalet." She's like, I cried for nothing.
Well, I'm glad to hear you had
that
an interesting experience.
Yeah. Well, but sorry, just one other thing, because this is relevant to the Army, and it's also relevant to sort of what I write about, because as well as writing about modeling, a little bit what I talked about, the scientific model, an important idea there is the idea of habits, things that we do without thinking. And one of the things that made me decide to leave the Army was I had a negligent discharge. That's when you fire a weapon when you're not supposed to. Accidental discharge, negligent discharge is quite serious offense. And if you think about it, you're working with a gun and it goes off. I was very lucky no one got hurt. And I remember this happened, I was in Northern Ireland. I was the armorer. I was supposed to be inspecting weapons and fixing them. So I pick up a weapon because there's a certain thing that we have to check. I can't remember what it was, but I was supposed to check that all weapons had this modification. So I go to the Quick Reaction Force hut where they've got all their weapons locked and loaded. And this goes back a little bit to my training. Our weapons training in basic training wasn't as thorough as it was for, say, an infantry person. They would be drilled endlessly on things that you do with a weapon. You pick up a weapon, first thing you do, cock it 3 times, make sure the mag's off, cock it 3 times, check the chamber, make sure there's no round in it, shout clear. And this is something you do before walking, when picking up a strange weapon, before walking into a building with your weapon, basic weapon safety. And I say this now sort of nonchalantly, it's only because I had an accident that I realized how important it was. And the level of weapon training we had in basic training wasn't to the point where we did it automatically. And I was talking to my dad about it, and he says it's because you're REME and you're expected to be smarter, and this idea that you could think about it and sort of just know. And it's a big part of what I write about in mental models, learning how to learn mental models, is turning things, instead of thinking about things, just doing it by instinct so you can do it without thinking. And so basically what happened was I went to a QRF hut, picked up a weapon, didn't do the mag off, click 3, cock it 3 times, or eject it 3 times to make sure there was no magazine and everything. I just started taking this weapon apart. And I noticed an odd color, like this brass color. And bear in mind, I was a little bit dozy at the time, like sleep deprived, whatever. I wasn't paying attention to my job. I saw something was wrong, dimly realized that there was still a magazine attached. Not only that, there was a magazine with bullets in it. So I put the weapon together, and instead of taking the magazine off and unloading it, I fired the weapon. And this was inside a bunker. Weapon went off. Holy sugar. And, went into minor shock. Ended up getting charged and, having to go in front of the CO. Apparently I was almost going to get kicked out of Ireland, because my job as an armor was supposed to be, I was supposed to know how to work with weapons. And I had flashbacks for a while afterwards, like, thank God no one was in front of me when I fired that weapon. But then I sort of had that thought in my mind. It's like, maybe a life in the army isn't the best thing for me. This apart from the fact that working with guns was so boring anyway. But that idea of habits of making things automatic was a very big is a very big part of the mental models books of turning things into habits.
Yeah, thanks very much for sharing that really good story. And yeah, no, very glad to hear no one was in front of you when that happened. But it's you tell it so well because I think that that happens more often than we might think, where like, because someone, let's say, talk about being is thought to be smarter, but sort of like have a talent for something, and people often think either of themselves or of other people that you can skip steps because of that.
Yeah,
And I've had my own experience with that, professionally. And there are some things that you just have to learn. It doesn't matter how smart you are. If you make someone the coach of a football team and they don't know what a down is, American football, for anyone watching, they're not going to be able to coach the team. And they're
yeah,
really, and but also, and it's interesting when we talk about your other book, No to Flow. I know you talk a little bit about in there about how, like, sometimes getting out of the flow is really important too, because then it can give you perspective on things, especially specifically with respect to mistakes you might be making. I think the example you use in the
yeah,
book is carving. You were just sort of carving away, and then like wood carving, and then you realized you'd made a kind of like, kind of funny. If you get the book, you'll see why it's funny. But you made a kind of funny mistake with what you were carving. But and this is jumping ahead a little bit, but it's interesting how, like, and these things are sort of tied. The things that you write about and the things that you do in your life are tied into these explicit sort of awarenesses of experiences that you've gone through. But that one thing one can do specifically with something you think you're really good at or you've done a million times is you can just dive into it and start doing it. And but you might have done something wrong from the very beginning, and you go way down the path and then someone else comes along who might not know anything about it and go, what are you doing? And then you
yeah.
kind of snap out of it and go, oh my God. And like, in my former days as an investment banker, I did a lot of like financial modeling in Excel. And that was something that, like, that was like a common, like a thing that like I did over and over again, which was like, just like someone would give me a task, like, build a model of an electricity generation business or something like that, and I'd start going down it and it'd be like, no, I did like, I just made some faulty, the logic was all right, the Excel kind of was all masterful, but there was some, like, bad assumption from the beginning, because my brain was like, oh, who cares about like the actual third decimal place, when I should have been
Yeah,
caring about that. And anyway, it is interesting how, like, both of our, like, we can make these mistakes about ourselves, but other people can make those mistakes about us too. And there are some things that you just need to learn, and there are some things that you just need to drill into yourself as habits.
big time. And actually, that's what you're just talking about there reminds me one. So at the army, I applied to University of Waterloo, and I got in. I studied systems design. But one of my co-op terms, I actually ended up working at a gun factory, a rifle factory, right in Waterloo. My physics professor, um, John McPhee, hooked me up with a guy who worked there. So I think my first job, my first co-op job in university was working at a gun factory, and I had to do a drawing for a spring, and it was on AutoCAD or something like that. And we went back and forth about 20 times simply because I was an idiot, because I would do it, do the drawing, make a change, give it to him. And he said, "You forgot this." So I'd do it again, make a change. But in the meantime, I'd forget something else. I never, ever, each time I gave it to him, I never checked my work. He said, "You didn't do this." Give it to him. "You didn't do this." And I went forward. And so it's a, so that's, that too, that idea of checking is an important part of stepping out of the flow, because, both in Know Flow and the mental model, the idea, one of the things, and this goes back to the idea of science, where a model is never perfect. You have to keep on improving it. And so the idea with mental models is not worrying about, in order to be in the flow mode or the fluid mode, which is what I like to refer to it in mental models, you turn the thinking, the judging mind off, you go into the flow. Then when you come out, you check. And then based on the mistakes you made, then you practice those, what you made the mistakes with, so you can improve those. So next time you're in the flow, you can be in the flow both without thinking. Basically, what you're doing is working on the model so that the model outputs correctly. But a big, so one part, I'm sort of getting away from myself here, testing. So one part of modeling is understanding that it is an iterative process. You repeat it. It's going to be wrong. So each iteration, you make it less wrong or more right. Another important point is, as you said, is checking your work. And one of the things I talk about a lot in both Know Flow and learning how to learn mental models is the idea that we have two mental modes, more than two, but the two I focus on. One is the thinking mode, where we can look back at what you've done, say looking at a drawing to make sure that you've done all the things, or looking back at an Excel spreadsheet to make sure everything is everything is correct, everything matches what you have been told, everything matches what you want the program to do, or what whoever asked you to do the program wants it to do. So for ourselves, so doing something, these two mental modes allow us to do something without worrying about doing it right. And then afterwards, we can step out of the flow to look back at what we've done, to see what we need to work on, to see if it's right or wrong at, whatever degree, whatever level of rightness we're working towards. But this also applies with doing things outside of ourselves. So doing a drawing, you do the drawing, look at it. Is that right? Programming, you do some code, run the program, look at it. Is it right or wrong? And I should say, I understand that testing is sometimes the most biggest pain in the butt things, but one of the most horrific experiences I had was, I'm sure you're familiar with the Y2K changeover and how everyone had to check the computers. And one of my first jobs after university was working at a company. It was a gas and oil company, and we had to check all these computers. I had to go there late at night. I just broken up with a girlfriend, so was traumatized from that. And I was going every night doing the most boring job. This was even more boring than working with guns, running through these endless test cycles to make sure that everything was working right. But on one hand, it was boring, but on the other hand, it taught me the idea of how important testing is. And it doesn't have to be that difficult if you do it in small batches. Like you, in the interview I was watching, sorry, what was his name again?
Simon Brown.
Simon Brown was talking about doing, I think it was Simon Brown. Sorry, it's right open. He was talking about learning programming by magazine, and you do this program and take about a month or two before you realize there's an error in the code. And so, you be doing this, and it's like, holy sugar, this was a month ago. And so one idea with mental models, or building mental models, or just learning in general, even if it's math. So for math example, if you do a math question, if you're trying to learn it, the sooner you can check the result, the sooner you check the answer, the easier it is to correct that model, the easier it is to learn. And this, So I'll just stop there because I think I've babbled on enough.
Yeah, no.
At that
It's
point.
interesting how one thing I keep bringing up is how all these things fit together. And it's interesting too. I mean, I guess we've kind of moved on to talking about the book, but before we formally do that, I want to sort of close out the first part of the interview by asking you how you got to Taiwan,
Ooh,
if you're up for
that's the
talking.
part embarrassing. Yeah, no, it's kind of. So I lived in Calgary for a while, and then for whatever reason, actually, it was because a girl I met on a yoga retreat. I decided to move to Chicago, but before I moved to Chicago, we broke up, but I decided to move to Chicago anyway. And then things started to. I lasted in Chicago for a little while, but after a while, um, basically, I started getting into a lot of credit card debt and not sure what I wanted to do with myself. So I ended up moving back to my parents' house. Um, had debt collectors calling saying, "Hey, you owe this money," and I was sort of in this space where I didn't have a clue what I wanted to do with my life. And of course, my parents were a bit worried because I was living in their basement. So I was probably 30 years old living in my parents' basement, basically living off of them. And the only two things I really knew that I wanted to do, I was interested in Chinese calligraphy at the time, and I was also interested in Tai Chi, which is also relevant to sort of some of the stuff I write about. Actually, the Chinese calligraphy, both of them. And so initially I thought about moving to Beijing because that would be a place where it'd be really, there's a lot of good martial arts going on there. And then a friend of my dad said, well, why not try Taiwan? It's a lot, you can still get access to Chinese calligraphy and Tai Chi. It's a lot nicer environment. The people are a lot nicer. So, okay, then I'll do Taiwan instead. In both instances, my initial idea was to teach English because I didn't know anything else. And yoga, I'd been teaching yoga for a number of years, and I didn't think teaching yoga was a possibility. So I basically, first of all, tied up loose ends with respect to my finances in Canada, applied some teaching jobs in Taiwan, got accepted, and moved to Taiwan and taught English for a year. And it was interesting because when I was looking into Taiwan, I was looking at all of these people who had English teaching jobs, and they all talked about teaching English for 4 years. And I found that disappointing because for whatever reason, I felt like I wanted to move to Taiwan to live there, even though I knew nothing about it, even though I'd never been there. And then I found out that some people do stay for a long time. So I moved here, taught English for a year, and then I met someone who said, "Oh, there's a new gym that's opened up, and they got a yoga studio. Should apply." So I went to this yoga studio, applied, and they said, "Yeah, you can teach yoga if you want." So I ended up teaching yoga, and that was sort of ended up becoming a full-time yoga teacher in Taiwan after moving here, and I've been that lasted until COVID, and now I'm getting back into programming, writing, and that's when I started on my Sensational Yoga Poses website.
That's a great way to end the first segment of the podcast. With you sort of landing in a place where you finally stayed. And so the first book that we've already talked about a little bit is Learning How to Learn Mental Models. And I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about the mental part of that, maybe more directly than we have so far. What is a mental model?
So I've read a couple of articles on mental modeling. There's one in particular that talked about different mental models where there's understanding bias. There's a bunch of things. It might have been called 101 mental models. And it is great. But my thought, and this is based on experiences in university working with professors, even in the Army, this idea of working from first principles, or even somehow got in my mind the idea of basic principles, something that you can use over and over again, which I hope is sort of carrying through this chat. So I was reading this and I thought 100 mental models is not the best way to do it. It's kind of, I thought there was a more basic way to approach mental modeling, and that is understanding the mental modeling software, if you like. And what I came to understand, and I might be completely wrong, but has worked for me, is this idea that anytime we learn something, the thing that we learn is a mental model. It's like, it's like you have your iPad and you stick an app on there. Each app is basically a model that does something. And a model, I should clarify in this case, a model isn't just a predictive thing. I think a better analogy is it's like a computer program with all that flexibility. I mean, computer programs that can access databases, they can be used to control fridges. I saw an ad just recently, and apparently they've got a coffee machine which is all computer programmed, and you can control temperature and all that. So programs allow you to do a lot of things, whether it's access a database or to control actual things. And so when I talk about a mental model, is anything in your brain that is clearly defined that does something specific. It could be remembering baseball stats, which I don't know that much about. It could be the program that you learn when you say learn a yoga pose or a tai chi, or how to catch a football. It's all the programs that go into controlling your body. It's memorizing data. It's the things that we use to represent the different people who we meet. Those are all models in a nutshell. Those are all the things. Now, I'm suggesting that for each of those discrete things, our brain has a mental model. And this guy wrote about it. I forgot the name. I mentioned it in the book. He talks about he says the neocortex is built up of all of these repeatable structures, which are all fairly self-similar. And he suggests that models are meant. I can't remember if he uses the term mental models. I've sort of maybe co-opted that, put it together, but this is the place where all this information is stored in our brain. And I don't really talk about the brain that much because I don't know about it. I just sort of mention it. And this is, I think there's some science to back it up, but it's mainly sort of looking at the brain as a black box and saying, okay, we can represent that anything that we learn, anything that's clearly defined that we learn as a mental model. Is that
that's really
understandable?
Good. It is. It's really interesting actually, because I mean, what you talk about, the way you're talking now, but the way you write about things in the book is like paying what I'm using the word explicit, but like paying explicit attention to things that I think most of us just we're kind of on rails all the time, right? Like, so for example, the way a lot of people approach aspects of their lives, it's not like they think, oh, I've got this sort of structure that I use when I go to get groceries, for example. You just go and get groceries. But actually, if you take a step back from it and you think about it, oh, what do I actually do? Well, the first thing I do is I make a list. A list is actually a really interesting thing. And then what do? Well, I make sure I'm dressed before I go out. And in order to do that, I make sure I know what the weather's like. Is it raining? Is it going to rain? Is it packed with snow like in an Ontario winter? Things like that. And actually the model of that you do have a model of going grocery shopping, and it's actually rather complex. And the thing I like about your books is it reminds you that you can step back from all of these things and actually like think about them. And then the interesting, what's sort of even more interesting is the next step, which is the term that the first place I remember coming across ideas along these lines and what it means for your identity was in this Heideggerian philosopher named Hubert Dreyfus, who talked about something called intentionality all the way down, which is a way of saying exactly that. Like it's more or less from a kind of existentialist psychoanalysis kind of. Well, no, that's saying too much for that idea. But the idea is that you can do something deliberately and deliberately do it so much that it becomes automatic. And how do you relate to that as a part of your identity now? Is it natural, or is it artificial? Is it deliberate or not? Because if you're not thinking it was deliberate at one point, does that mean it's still deliberate now? And how responsible are you for sort of your automated responses to things if they were deliberately created by you?
Well, and that's, this ties into the idea of habits, because the other thing, and I think this is an important part, is each model, the way I'm approaching it, each model has, depending, and again, this relates to Simon Brown's talk about, his 14 model, big, small, smaller, smallest. And in a sense, I'm using a very similar approach for mental models, is that you can break them down into components. But as well, what's important is that each model has a habit associated with it. And I define a habit as anything that you can do without thinking. And it doesn't mean that you can't be aware of it as is happening, but in general, it's something you can do without thinking. The importance of that is, and this relates to being in the flow, is when you build these models, whether you choose to modularize it, build it up of component habits, or if it's just something that you learn without that sort of breaking things down. The idea is that when you're in a flow, you use these habits to act effectively without thinking. And when you don't act effectively, that's when you look back at it so that you can train that model, so that you can train that habit.
Yeah, thanks very much for introducing that concept there, the concept of habit. That was the sort of word I was reaching for, but hadn't quite gotten to myself. And just in the interest of moving on, so it's a great book. Everybody should get it. But the other book that I wanted to talk to you about, which is in a bundle that you have together, is Know to Flow. And I was wondering if you could just take a moment to talk about what you mean by flow, and maybe give us an example of it.
Well, the reason for the title Know to Flow, apart from the alliteration, was the idea, and again, it sort of relates to, the two books are almost exactly the same in some ways, is just from slightly different points of view. The mental models focuses on models and the things that we build when learning. Models is the things we build when learning. Know to Flow is about actually getting into the flow. And it's a simple way to define flowing is you're not thinking. You turn that. Another way to think about thinking is when you judge. And so, an example, if you're writing out math equations really quickly, you could write them out and say, okay, did I get that right? And you try and check it. Or, with something like simple math. So most of us already know without thinking 2 + 2 is 4. Some of us already know, maybe from doing it, 12 times 12 is 144. And that's without thinking. You just know. And so so basically being in the flow is being able to act without thinking. And the idea of know to flow is you can have so the Japanese call the same state no mind, N-O, no mind. And I sort of jokingly refer to as no mind, K-N-O-W. So when they talk about no mind, they mean not thinking, but you can also think about it as knowing exactly what it is you want to do. And if we go back to the 4C model, Simon Brown talks about it, it's sort of taking a very high level look at what you're doing and say, what is this, whatever it is you're doing, what is it for? So for example, if I do upward dog, there's a bunch of details you could think about in order to do it. And I would suggest that when you don't know your body, part of it can be, say, focusing on the shoulders, maybe lifting them up. You could practice just lifting, lowering your shoulders to get a feel for it. And you could just focus on that action while in downward dog to get a feel for it. And because it's a very simple action, you can hold it, that can be the very simple thing that and because you're focusing on feeling the body, right? That's one way to get into the flow, particularly when you're doing something physical, is to focus on physical sensation. This is something, I'll teach my students to feel when the shoulders lifted and when it's lowered. And you can feel the muscle activation. You can feel the shoulder moving relative to your head or to your chest. But then once you've learned that, say you know your body, a very simple thing that you can focus on doing in downward dog is just, so if you're in downward dog, you can reach your butt away from your hands. And that can be a very simple instruction. And so the idea of, just reach your hips back away from your hands, but also up away from your feet. So the idea of know to flow is knowing very simply what it is you're trying to do, or in other terms, know the change that you're trying to create. What is it you're trying to do? And that can apply to anything. It's sort of, it goes back to taking a step back. Used an example, carving. Sometimes you need to take a step back from what you're doing. It's like, what exactly is it that I am trying to do? Not the details. You also need to know what the thing is that holds all those details together. Focus on that simple thing. And basically lead with that simple idea. It's basically leading. It's like Battlestar Galactica, Adama. He didn't know whether they're going to find planet Earth or not. The idea of hope, we're going to find Earth, whether or not it's out there. And he led with that simple idea, and he pulled everyone along based on that simple idea. Leanpub, making it easy for writers to write a book. That's a simple idea that holds everything that you do together, all the little elements. For myself, it's trying to help people better understand what it is they're trying to do. I'm still trying to figure out what my sort of thing that holds everything together is, but you can just break it down. At this moment in time, what is it that I am trying to do?
Yeah, that's a really beautiful image, actually, of what's going on in Battlestar Galactica, which is actually people being led by an idea or by a hope. I have one sort of specific, kind of a personal question about flow. So one of my summer jobs when I was in undergrad was tree planting in the mountains in British Columbia mostly. And this was a very repetitive thing that involved, planting hundreds to thousands of little seedlings a day. And what you would do is you would have them you'd have a cache of trees in boxes, and you would have these bags on your back, and you would go and load up, and then you go and you have a shovel and you make a hole and stick a tree in and close it with your foot and then move on. And we had a concept of being in the zone. And I'd heard about this and I didn't, from veterans, as we called them, I didn't really know what it meant until one day I was planting along at about 10 a.m. and then it was 6 p.m. And like I had no memory of any time that elapsed between, sort of 10 a.m. and 6 p.m. But I knew exactly how many trees I'd planted because we got paid, per tree, and it was important to keep track of them anyway. Is that an example of being in the flow?
Very definitely. And that's an example of how to get into the flow is by doing something repetitive. And I don't know if you ever read Artist's Way, but she talks about it. She Julia Cameron is the thing. She talks about this thing called morning pages, a bunch of different stuff for becoming a better artist. For guys, it can be something simple like shaving. You just get in the zone. Sometimes driving a regular route. Obviously you should be paying attention to the road, but it's very easy to get in the zone. You just sort of daydream, and your habits are ideally checking everything. But yeah, something automatic like tree planting is exactly that. And that's, and it's something, I complained about doing Y2K testing. And I think that's one thing that can hinder getting into the flow. And, when you're complaining and I don't want to do this, that's one sort of way that you can recognize the thinking mind not being in the flow. And as soon as you turn that off, it can become a lot easier. And as you experience, time just, it stops. And I'll give one example for me where it became really apparent is I used to be into speed skating, which is the reason I moved to Calgary. And yet again, I'd been dumped by a girl and was quite heartbroken. And I was in this, and it was one of those things where it'd be constantly in my head. I'd be like, oh, I miss her and all this and everything I did wrong, even though I was one who probably ended the relationship. Or no, I didn't. I moved to Australia. That was it. And then she ended up breaking with me. But anyway, I was in this skating ring. I was doing this one-sided skating drill. I'd glide on one foot, sort of tip to the side, and then catch myself on the other foot, glide, and then repeat the process. And always going through my head, sort of like exactly like tree planting was this glide, lean, balance, lean, glide, repeat, balance, lean, glide. And I was absorbed in this. And it wasn't quite as long as your tree planting experience, but I got up from that. And the reason I recognized I'd been in the zone was I'd completely stopped thinking about my ex. And it was just like,
Mm.
wow, my brain felt so clear and it was so wonderful. So yeah, so that's, I explained to someone else, it's a feeling you get when you're daydreaming. When you're just, not sort of thinking, just remembering things. Like I remember walking, I was in Bavaria at the time, and I was walking along and I was smiling because I was thinking about this Laurel and Hardy movie. And I think it was the part where Stan was perhaps stuck under his head was peeking above, his head was in a hole in the floor, and Laurel pulled his head up and his neck lengthened.
Oh.
For some reason, I was thinking about that, and it just made me laugh. And then this big smile on my face walking along. Same sort of thing. I'd say then I was in the zone, even though it was in my memory. It wasn't thinking. I was just reminiscing. So those are all sort of examples of being in the zone. Sometimes it can be while doing something, but sometimes it can be just letting things run through your head. And and a nice way to be when you just sort of, it can also be a nice, this is, I can't remember if I mentioned it in Know to Flow, or I do mention it briefly in the learning how to learn. That sort of mind state can be very important as well when you're trying to solve problems, because it's like you sort of turn away from the problem. Like one time I was in Malaysia, I was thinking about this Tai Chi move with a sword. I was just walking along, and walking is another way to get into the flow, into the zone, just walking along because it's a nice repetitive exercise. And I just, all of a sudden, I had this idea for this Tai Chi movement, which was giving me problems. Like I just had this inspiration, like I could, if I just, like with skating, if I just tip the sword, then the weight of the sword itself can carry it through and I can do that movement. So I went back to my hotel room and practiced with an umbrella. So those are some examples of flow, and why being able to get into that mode is beneficial. You can use it to solve problems. You can just learn it to enjoy life.
Um, just one note about enjoying things before we move on to the last part of the interview where you talk about your experience as a writer. What you were saying there, I can't help, but I've studied a little bit of martial arts in my life as well. And there's a few of the things you've said, just for this is totally tangential, but for anyone listening, if you've ever wondered how people can spend so much time and like, not just like, in the day, but like, throughout their lives in martial arts, Neil just gave you a perfect example of it. Moves, particularly in why do martial arts have forms, for example, and there's a lot of or katas in Japanese, and like, there's a lot of reasons, there's a lot of answers to those questions, but one of the reasons it's so compelling, at least good, I would say good martial arts, is that moves can be kind of puzzles. And you can be taught something and you can be really good at it and have no idea why it works the way it does. And then you can have these revelations about, why the move is the way it is, why you were taught the move that way. And so you can actually kind of know secrets without knowing that you know them, and then you can actually discover them. But another thing you can do is you can discover, as it were, kind of improvements. You want to be careful with those, but they happen
Yeah,
too.
yeah,
And there's just incredible depth in simplest, like what might appear to be the simplest things. And I'm sure people who do, jujitsu or dance, and I mean, of course, yoga, are all familiar with this kind of thing. And the familiar is the things you learn about your body and positioning and weight and balance and things like that is really just endless. But with that, going down that self-indulgent digression, so in the last part of the interview, we talk about your work as a writer. Do you have a practice for getting into the flow of writing?
it's to me a lot of my writing. So a lot of my writing right now is based on. So if I'm teaching yoga, for example, and a lot of what I do as a yoga teacher is break things down. So for example, just lifting the shoulders, but not just lifting the shoulders, focusing on feeling. But if I find something that's particularly interesting, in more or less the same way you talked about, doing martial arts, when I'm teaching, I don't know, I rarely follow a teaching plan, just sort of figure it out as I go, because a lot of it's based on the students' abilities, because I'm teaching in an open class, so different levels of students all the time. And so I might make a discovery. It's like, oh, that's really interesting. So for one, I did a series of videos on opening up the hip crease or feeling the hip crease. Or I did a series of classes, and I thought, okay, I'll turn that into a series of videos. But in the same way, when I'm writing, because a lot of my writing is from my website, but also for some of my yoga books, it's but also in general based on other things that I do. Um, if it in general, most of my writing is based on direct experience, and that's basically what I try to write about. And just as an aside, when I was in the army, I went parachuting for the first time, and I wrote about the experience. And in a similar way, when I was doing the yoga teacher training, I wrote about how to do a particular pose. In the case of the letter, my dad said, "Oh, I showed your letter to a bunch of people," and they said it was like they were actually in the plane, letting go. And with the when I was writing about doing a certain pose, I think it was headstand, and the guy says, "Oh, were you actually doing this as you were writing about it?" And one experience I have had with writing when the writing has been particularly good, and what I want to try and get back to, is sort of not thinking about what I want to write, but actually sort of going through what I'm writing about. And it's particularly easy when it's direct experience. So with parachuting, it's like, okay, I got on the edge of the plane, I grabbed onto the struts. It's kind of hard to, this was 20, 30 years ago. And the way I explained it was I was actually visualizing what I was doing as I wrote the letter. I edged out onto the strut, you know, feet let go. I looked up, saw the happy face. As soon as I saw the happy face, let go. It just went on from there. But a lot of times when I write from personal experience, it comes out better. And another way that I write. So when I was writing letters home, sometimes I would, this was by hand. I would just know what I want to write. I would just write, and it goes back to flow. It is being like in the flow. Oftentimes I just know what to write and I just let it come out on paper, and then afterwards I edit it. And that's where I enjoy writing the most, is just not thinking about it, just letting it happen, and then afterwards going and tidying up. And then the tidying up process is when I get into okay, if it's a bit too jumbled, what is it I'm trying to write about? And Derek Sivers, who I think is another person you wrote about, he talks about his writing process the same way. He tries to minimize it. Anything that isn't relevant, based on what I remember what he wrote about, he said anything that isn't relevant to that particular section, he gets rid of. And that's what I try to do, based on what he said. That's what I try and do with my writing when I'm going over. Is it relevant? Because I can babble on, from this podcast, as you can see. Is this relevant to what this particular section is about? And if not, scratch it. And that in a nutshell is how, when I'm writing, it's easy. It's definitely easier with the shorter paragraphs, to try and make it clear.
Yeah, thanks very much for sharing that. It's really interesting. It reminded me of something a point you made earlier on in the interview, but that you make in your book and your writing as well, is that one ought to approach these things that one does iteratively, right? You're going to have more than one go at it. So when you're learning a practice, you're going to do it over and over and over again. And if you get it, just you dive in, start doing it, you're going to make mistakes. That's actually a part of the learning process. That's how if you see someone who's really good at something, it's because they did it over and over again, and learned from their mistakes. And that this is just you should anyway. Yeah. Sorry.
Sorry, that just one point. And a large part of learning to learn is, understanding the iterative process, but also understanding it in a way, and hopefully it's, if you look at the preview of the book, I think it's pretty clear. There's a way that you can make the iterative process less painful and less wasteful, but also the idea of learning how to learn is to make that iterative process much more efficient, less time consuming, but also, going back to the mental models, it's learning how to build mental models in such a way that if you learn a mental model in one domain, you can apply some aspects of it to other domains. So it's more like, I would say it's more like learning how to program versus learning how to use a bunch of different apps, like learning how to program to create your own app, learning how to create an app that does everything you want it to do and nothing else. Basically that.
I know that's great. The last question I always ask of a guest on the podcast, if they're a Leanpub author, is if while you're using Leanpub, and you've been around for a while, so you might have more than one answer to this, but the last question I always like to ask is if there was one thing that when you were using Leanpub, you had you shaking your fist, going, "Damn you, Leanpub! Why does this suck so bad?" Or and that we could fix for you, or if there was one magical, just out of nowhere feature you could ask us to build for you, can you think of anything you would ask us to do?
Um, well, first of all, I'll say that I love Leanpub, and I think I talked to you before. I used it. I first used it maybe 10 when you first started out, and then I took a break because I was focusing more on video content, and then came back, and it's sort of the improvements you've done have been really good. To be honest with you, I there are there was some. Oh, I think the only thing I've seen this with lots of different companies, so it's not just Leanpub, but the help. Actually, no, there is one thing: the the menu system. And again, I say this with the understanding I've built a 500 web page website. I've also built a website with 7,000 pages, like this Chinese dictionary project. Indexing, which is basically, to my mind, sort of building a menu system, is really, really challenging to get difficult to get right. And I mean, part of my website building process, I spent 10, 12 years building sensational yoga poses, and it was a constant iterative process of improving the navigation. And I would say the most frustrating thing for me is the navigation, so for example, finding I wanted to look for Google Analytics. And I know that is probably the only thing. But at the same time, I understand that building navigation, because you've got lots of different users with different backgrounds, building navigation is a challenging subject. That's about the only thing I would say. That being said, I figured it out. You've got enough resources where I could find it. It's just sort of going around
And was
looking
there
for
something
it.
about our help center documentation that you were gonna?
Um, yeah, because and again, I've seen this with other documentation. It's sort of like a constant trail of finding links to the article that you're looking for. So for me, it was the looking for because I do, and a long time ago, I was doing Chinese dictionary projects where I want to have the book published as an English book, but with the ability to include Chinese text. So it's a mix of Chinese and English. And looking through, I was trying to see if the Marquardt 3 had the ability to do that, to switch between languages, and it doesn't, but that's all right because I can just go back to the original Leanpub, what's the Leanpub, the
Leanpub
original
flavored
language
markdown.
called? Leanpub. I can just go back to that, which is fine, which is what I was using before. But finding the actual article was really challenging. I didn't know how to find it. And in the end, I just used the help, and you guys are always responsible with help. So that was, and again, I've seen that sort of problem with a lot of help pages, and I don't know if there's an easy fix for it or not. And I wouldn't hold it against you guys because everything else is great. Like I think your mission, everything else is great. So those are the only two
Yeah,
things I would bring up.
yeah, no, that's really good. Thanks for that. You're not the first person to make the point about our navigation being confusing. Yeah, as you mentioned, we do have people who come at it not necessarily the different levels of expertise or what have you. Sort of using the web and stuff like that is an issue. But the main sort of like problem is that Leanpub is used both to search for things and buy them and then read them, and to create the
Yeah,
things that the people are searching for and buying. So there's this
yeah,
two-dimensional thing, and so often, sort of somehow maintaining both the interests of people who are using it for these, very different purposes, maintaining both of their interests at the same time. Is just challenging, and that's not an excuse, but it's something we're always working to improve. Our current sort of what we settled on a little while ago is having what I call the escape hatch, which is what's called a hamburger menu at the top right. That opens up a bunch of options.
Yeah.
And then we need to talk about this better, but we have what we call the author app side of things. So that's when if you click on the
Yeah.
escape hatch and you click on author, then you'll see a menu that'll show like books, courses, bundles, and stuff. And so if you click on books, for example, if you click on author and books, now you're in the what we call the author app. So you'll see your unpublished
Yeah.
books, you'll see your published books. If you click on a book, that will take you to the book overview page, which is a big page with all the pages in different
Yeah.
sections and stuff like that. But yeah, the sort of like serving the interests of readers and authors at the same time on the same site is sort of reflected in the difficulty of getting around. But it is something we're always trying to improve, and we are sensitive about. When it comes to the help center, we're not sort of helps. We should be better at that. The main thing we try to do is to give articles the right titles, and in the sort of like byline for the article include keywords that sort of help improve search. So naming the articles properly so that they just come up in a search is one thing we try to do. And one way we try and do that is we sort of name the articles kind of inspired by the emails or what have you, that messages that we've received from people looking for answers.
Yeah.
So we try to do that. But yeah, the structure of it is not something up the help center. Like there is some structure there, but not much. And that's definitely something that we could improve. Definitely.
Just to give the context, I mean, I've looked at my own website and been looking for articles, and that's inspired me to change my own navigation. It's sort of, like I said, I wrote all this stuff on my website, and I have trouble finding stuff myself. So it isn't meant as a, I think you guys do a great job. Though, I completely understand the challenges with working with something big, and especially when you're trying to work with, two different groups of people who you're trying to serve. It's a bit of a challenge, but overall, great job.
No, that's I really appreciate the kind words. And the last thing actually I wanted to mention. So actually, by coincidence, just yesterday we released something called Tech Live 2023. So this is the kind of back end of our book generation process, was just updated to be modernized. That we were on the 2017 version of this, and what that's going to enable us to do is let you have your language switcher in Markua 0.30. So we don't have it. We haven't done it yet, but we will be able to do that in Markua 0.30. So which is the latest version of our plain text markup syntax. That's what if you write a Leanpub book, that's what you're writing in. That's the instructions for the book formatting and stuff like that. So anyway, you're going to get that hopefully relatively soon. So just to end on a happy note.
That's great news.
Well, Neil, thank you very much for taking the time out of your day to talk to me and to talk to our audience about your life and about your work and about your ideas. And thank you very much for being a Leanpub author.
Well, thank you very much for having me. It was fun chatting.